Power Alacrity Mechanist, the absolute cheat class of Guild Wars 2. The class can compete in challenge mode fractals, raiding, meta events. With capped might, alacrity and fury, as well as aegis and stability on occasion, the class brings so much. Easy boon strip access, mobility skills, immobilizing, you name it, it has. It has group-wide barrier as well. This class allows healers to take other traits as it provides so much utility and protection. This is also the kind of class that allows you to take no healer runs in fractals and even some raids. Let's have a look at why this class is just so damn good. For fractals, we're giving this a 5 out of 5. You've got to do it. If you can do challenge modes, even CM100 as a power class, you're definitely a 5 out of 5. Raiding, we're going to go for about a 4 out of 5. You'll be able to do every single raid. Although you might not compete with the other supports in terms of DPS, you're going to bring a lot more utility and survivability to the group, as well as allowing your healer to take other utilities. For landscape and meta, we're going 5 out of 5. Incredible personal boons, as well as just everything you need to make a meta event succeed. This class can succeed in almost any encounter and has a variety of different builds. We'll link maybe 3 different builds in the description below. We'll try hit every single experience range. Have a look if you're interested. And with an introduction like that, you've got to wonder, why doesn't everyone just play this class if it's so good? Let's have a look at some of the weaknesses. As well, I will do my best to dispel and ease your fears of these weaknesses. Don't be put off by this class. Let's have a look at the weaknesses. Weakness number 1. The Power Alacrity Mech only uses a rifle. This can feel like not really the most engaging gameplay to have such a simple class with such a simple rotation. Even though for a new player that's experiencing raids or fractals or challenge modes for the first time, this can be a big comfort as you don't have to worry about complex rotations and worrying about trying to hit benchmarks and trying to keep up a lag uptime. This class can be very, very helpful for newer players, but some of the top tier players don't like it because it is just so simple. Weakness number 2. Keeping boon uptime. The Power Alacrity Mechanist can do great jobs while it is DPS in. As long as the mech and yourself are attacking targets, you are able to keep up a high boon uptime. But during split phases or phases in fights where you're not able to DPS, your boon uptime could suffer. You don't have as a reliable way of producing alacrity like some of the other support classes. Weakness number 3, the last weakness. Actual overall benchmark DPS. Benchmark DPS for other Alac supports are either just under or over the 30k mark, making them all fairly close together. Where the Power Alacrity Mechanist top benchmark at the current period is only 26k, and this is even slightly inflated due to some traits that we take that increase our DPS based on the amount of conditions on the target. While on the training dummy, those numbers are slightly inflated. But I want to ease your fear on this. You'll do, especially as a newer player, probably close to benchmark easier on a class like this than you would on one of the other Alac support classes. My advice to you is, if you are keen on getting extremely good and sweaty tryhard on this game, start your raiding or your fractals if you want to play support on a Power Alacrity Mech, and then from there look at some of the other options further on down the line when you're comfortable with the fights. Let's have a look at some stats. For the Power Alacrity Mechanist, the most important thing is getting your precision to 45%. 45% allows us, with Fury and certain traits, to get 100% crit chance. This is very important for our DPS uptime. The elite sweaty tryhards are running about 35% boon duration, but anything above that is perfectly acceptable. If not, try get as much power or ferocity as humanly possible, as this will up your DPS substantially. For runes, there's only one option really, Rune of the Scholar. We want the power and ferocity, trying to make sure that we do as much DPS as possible. And for your weapons, it's super simple, just a rifle. A rifle with force, and you can either take the Sigil of Air for raiding, or the Sigil of Impact for fractals. You can decide, you can either have one raiding weapon and one fractal weapon, or you can just be like me and just have one weapon and just lose a little bit of DPS on fractals. It doesn't affect you as much, but you will definitely have a bit more DPS output. For food, there's only really 2 options. You can either go for the peppercorn crusted sous vide steak. This is the main for most power classes, power and ferocity, big DPS. although you can consider something like the beef carpaccio. 100 concentration and 70 power. Yes, you are going to drop a fair amount of DPS, but the concentration will help you if you are uncomfortable and you want better boon uptime. This is definitely the item to take. For cheaper options, you have the butternut squash soup and also the soul pastries. For utilities, there's only one option. You want the superior sharpening stones for the damage output. The extra power will increase your DPS by a substantial amount. Luckily for us, the Power Alacrity trait tree is quite easy to understand and explain. Not too complicated and not any variation within. Let's have a look at it now. Let's look at explosions. Explosive entrance. Every time you enter combat or dodge roll, your next attack is an explosion attack with some big AoE damage. Glass cannon. If your health's above 75%, you're doing 10% increased damage. And quite an important trait here, Steel Pack Powderer. Every explosion creates vulnerability. This is quite needed for fractals and even sometimes in raids to make sure that the target is capped on vulnerability. In column 2, aim assisted rockets, an absolute great skill. Passively every 3 seconds shooting at the target. It's an explosion, therefore providing extra vulnerability. After 4 stacks, it switches from aim assisted rocket to orbital command strike. Basically just doing a massive AoE hit with a blast finisher. This can help with whatever light field or fire field is down on the floor to do some extra cleansing or some might stacking. Minor trait 3, shape charge. Every single stack of vulnerability on your target increases your damage to the target. This makes it quite worthwhile to make sure that you keep high or capped vulnerability at all times, as you should in any encounter. In column 3, Big Boom is definitely the choice to go. If you have more health than the target you're fighting, you're doing 15% increased damage, as well as every time an explosion hits the target, you're getting a heal over time. This can help you with some survival and some big DPS output. And now to the very, very important specialization, firearms. Sharpshooter. Your crits have a chance to make the target bleed. We're not a Condi build, but we don't complain about DPS. High caliber, very, very important. To be within 450 range and attack a target within 450 range increases your crit chance by 15%. This is extremely important, as you should try keep the target within this range to get this extra crit chance. If you have to attack a target from outside of the range, we have to do it. But if you can help it, try be within 450 to get this extra crit chance. This stacks perfectly with Hermetic Focus. You have increased chance to crit against bleeding foes, an extra 15%. These two equate to 30%, and with your Fury, that's how we get the full 100% with 45% crit chance. That's why you need to aim for 45. In column 2, no scope, classic. If the target's within 450 range and you crit, you have a 100% chance to get Fury. Fury also grants you Ferocity. That basically means that your crit magnitude and your devastate of crits is just going to be larger. This is a high DPS skill. This means that just keeping in mind to be within 450 range of targets to attain these boons very easily. Minor trait, Serrated Steel. Increased duration for bleeds. Remember, we don't care for the bleeds, although we do need the bleeds to make sure that our crit is capped, making this minor trait very, very good to have. Modified ammunition. For every condition on the target, you get 2% increased damage. This is why Power Alacrity Mech competes even on Challenge Mode 100, as even though it's mostly predominantly a condition fight, this increases your DPS on the target and allows you to still do comparable DPS to other classes. The only honorable mention is Pinpoint Distribution. You can take this trait if you need to produce extra might. 5 stacks of might every 10 seconds on an internal cooldown is fairly useful. And now let's look at the Elite Specialization Mechanist. Mechanical Genius is actually a nerf that they placed on the class because it was outperforming too much at launch. When you are within the distance threshold to your mech, it gains extra inherited stats from you. When out of range, it loses those stats and actually drops stats. There is a timer from 10 seconds ticking down, and if you're outside of your mech's range and the timer hits 0, the mech loses those stats, making keeping boon uptime almost impossible. This ensures that you have to kind of place yourself within your mech's range continuously. You have to micromanage with your F7 sometimes to pull it back within range. This can be especially difficult in fractals. In column 1, as well as becoming your F1 skill, we're going to go for the Mech Arms high impact drivers, i.e. the explosive knuckles. Explosive knuckles is a nice DPS in skill to have on your F1, but the main reason behind choosing this trait rather than anyone else is for the might up time. Every time your mech attacks with a 1 second cooldown, it will produce might to 5 targets within 600 radius around itself. That is why it's so important to let your mech auto attack on targets to generate the might. Minor trait 2, Rocket Punch, a very important skill to be aware of. When you use your skill 3, your mech will instantly use Rocket Punch. It has a 5 second cooldown which is not affected by Alacrity, but this is an important skill to make note of, as your net shot, you don't exactly do the biggest hard CC as immobilizes a soft CC. To actually allow it to do Rocket Punch and therefore giving you that extra 100 Defiance break bar, this is quite important for CCing in certain fights. In column 2, i.e. your F2 skill, the only choice is Mech Frame Channeling Conduits, i.e. the Crisis Zone. Crisis Zone is your F2 skill, a very important skill for maintaining Alacrity, as well Aegis and stability and protection on use. On a 30 second cooldown, it's a fairly long cooldown for this skill, but it can be huge, especially in some of the fractals. I think of Challenge Mode 100. Sometimes when you know the heal brand doesn't have an Aegis, it's important to make sure that you're the one blocking. As well, this is also a stun break. Mostly you'll use this skill as possibly off cooldown in most fights to make sure that you have high alacrity and protection uptime. Also, what the skill allows you to do is that your mech inherits more concentration and healing power from you. This allows the mech to maintain alacrity easier. As well, it gives the mech the ability that as it produces barrier, it produces alacrity as well. This is very needed to cap alacrity as a Power Alacrity Mechanist. And for your F3 skill and your last skill in column 3, Mech Core Barrier Engine is the only choice again, i.e. Barrier Burst. Barrier Burst is an important skill. It produces a lot of might, fury, as well as barrier. Barrier is basically just free life. It allows you to absorb more mechanics and therefore not take damage. But if you remember that our skill on our F2 allowed us to gain alacrity when we provide barrier. This means that per pulse of this skill, our F3 skill, we will also provide alacrity. This is a very important skill as well into helping us cap alacrity, especially on split phases. The skill also allows our mech to pulse barrier every 3 seconds. Now that we've had a look at specializations, let's look at Mechanical Genius in action. Notice that the mech is attacking and I'm attacking. The mech is getting might and barrier due to the traits chosen, the pulsing barrier for alacrity and also the auto attack might. Although I am out of range, so I am not receiving any of these boots. If the mech is to use skills that produce alacrity, it will keep the alacrity and have decent alacrity uptime. But remember, its stats are decreased because I'm out of range. Therefore, when out of range and using these skills, you're effectively nerfing your alacrity output. If you however move within range, you'll notice that its stats get better and its alacrity output is better. This makes it a lot easier to maintain decent boon uptime when you are within range of your mech and also when you're close to the target. Now let's have a look at your weapon skills. Rifle Burst with a half a second cooldown will happen while auto attacking, filled in by Rifle Burst Grenade. Remember, explosions produce vulnerability. Your help in fractals to produce vulnerability can mean the difference between some average output of DPS and some great output. Skill 2, Blunderbuss, an absolute great source of might as well as bleeding. Remember, you require the bleeding to cap your crit. We do take the trait in Firearm, Sharpshooter to also gather some bleeding, but this can help you, especially if you're outside of the range. Also notice that this skill does increase damage the closer you are to the target, as well as bleed duration increase. This is very important as well to maintain that extra crit chance. Skill 3, Net Shot, a deceptive skill. as even though it's a super long range Immobilize with decent duration, Immobilize being a soft CC and decent for breaking bars and holding targets down. But remember that this skill also procs Rocket Punch, extra damage, burning duration, as well as Defiance Break Bar, Overcharge Shot, an absolute Goliath, big DPS, as well as freeing you from slowing and movement impairing effects, as well as a decent Defiance Break Bar. Skill 4 and 3 are definitely the skills you use to absolutely shred some CC bars. Skill 5, Jump Shot, an incredible skill for closing the gap. Having this skill allows you to maneuver yourself in fractals as well as do certain mechanics and jumping puzzles a lot easier. It's a decent hitting skill with some big damage as well as vulnerability. Remember also that explosions do help with vulnerability uptime. Let's have a look at the mech skills themselves now. Explosive Knuckle, big DPS as well as weakness. This skill should almost be used off cooldown. F2, Crisis Zone. Remember, this is Aegis and stability. Generally you would like to use this off cooldown as it's an instant skill, although sometimes you want to save this for the Aegis or the stability based on the raid encounter or the fractal or even landscape, making sure to save your group from something that could easily down them. F3, Barrier Burst. This skill is very good for stacking might as well as alacrity. Just remember that your mech is locked in place. Just keep this in mind and make sure to not use the skill if you feel like your raid or your fractal group is going to move. Try use it when you know you're going to be stacked in a certain place for a decent amount of time. Let's have a look at our utilities now. Unfortunately, there are a few options we need to look at, but they shouldn't be too hard. First of all, let's look at the healing options. Generally, Rectify Signet is fairly decent, just general pulsed healing and big heal on demand, although there are some decent options. AED can save you from a one-shotter. This is fairly decent to use in some raid encounters to skip certain mechanics to allow you just to DPS and have better DPS uptime. Although Cleansing Burst, the healing turret, is probably one of the best ones, especially for raiding, not necessarily for fractals. Placing the turret down, producing an instant cleanse and then bursting it for extra vulnerability and damage can be pretty decent, as well as being a blast field. A non-negotiable utility for Signet, increasing our DPS by strike damage. Generally this skill is never activated, but if you do want to activate it, there is a Defiance Break Bar built into it, but at all costs this should be kept on to try to do as much DPS as possible. Another utility that's non-negotiable in most cases, Shift Signet. Increasing movement speed, but most importantly boons you gain or copy to your mech. This is incredibly helpful to make sure that your mech is producing as much alacrity, might and fury as possible. Although using the skill is not the worst thing in the world, as it is a stun break as well as a teleport that can help you in a lot of clutch situations to save a group, as well as being a personal condition cleanse. And generally this is the utility that you can switch around. Most often you'll use Grenade Kit. If you don't require anything else in the fight except for DPS, Grenade Kit's the way to go. Most of the time in Grenade Kit you'll use Grenades 5, 4 and 2. These add in not just extra vulnerability but also some unique debuffs that aren't often found. They're high DPS in skills, but also remember we want to try and proc modified ammunition to try increase our damage for each condition found. Even though there are so many great utilities for an engineer, I'm going to look at just a few of them that you might be interested in. For the larger CC, Personal Battering Ram. This skill produces the biggest break bar out of most of the utility skills that an engineer has, and therefore a good skill if you need some big break bar. Another great utility is the Toolkit. The Toolkit gives you an instant pull-in that allows you to deal with certain mechanics in raids, as well as a channeled block which might be useful for like a Mind Crush or the like. These are very situational uses and only required if you're the one dealing with that mechanic. Another great utility, Rocket Boots, removing movement impairing effects as well as being a decent sized leap and blast finisher with a bit of DPS attached to it. Having true charges makes this skill fairly decent in a lot of encounters. My personal favorite utility, Throw Mine. Most of the time I'll keep this active, especially in fractals, for boon stripping, decent CC, as well as vulnerability and big damage. This skill's got a fairly short cooldown, and often if you're in charge of boon stripping and fractals, this is definitely the skill to use. An honorable mention, although I do not recommend it for fractals and raiding too much, the barrier signet. Reducing incoming damage from strikes and conditional sources is fairly decent, giving you good survivability. Although, when active, it produces barrier, and we have traded that barrier produces alacrity. This is fairly decent for certain group survival, as well as helping you maintain decent alacrity uptime. I would say this is probably more for a very beginner build, although do consider it if you are struggling, or if you're on landscape and you want just a little bit of extra survivability and help in boon camp. Now, as many things with engineer, especially when you look at the utilities, there are a lot of interesting options. The same goes with the elite utility, although generally you're going to leave it on the overclock signet. Extra DPS, as well as if your mech dies in the fight, this is actually a way to instantly revive it. When using the skill, your mech will come alive and shoot the beam. A lot of the times in fractals, if my mech dies, I'll try save this skill, because there are certain points where generally I notice that the mech does die due to just extreme distributed damage on the floor. I'll use this skill to instantly revive him. Let's have a quick talk about rotation. Generally, I don't like to talk about rotation too much, as there are people way better at me than this game that have got a lot to say, and therefore I'm going to just keep it to the bare necessities. Remember, your job is to keep up alacrity and might as quickly as possible. So whether you want to jump shot straight to the target, or make sure that you use something like maybe your F2 skill as you're running in and you notice that your utilities lock, i.e. you're in combat. For your personal DPS, you want to try use blunderbuss as close to the target as possible to get as much DPS. Going into grenade kit using grenades 2, then 4 and 5. Make sure to use shrapnel grenades as close to blunderbuss as possible. Pushing the rest of your skills off of cooldown fairly as much, and F1. This will make sure that you do some decent DPS. Remember to use your overclock signet if you do not think your mech is going to die. If you do suspect your mech will die, save it and use it once the mech dies to revive the mech. Make sure that if you use net shot and your mech is using something like barrier burst, to be within 900 range of the target, so when you use net shot it still uses its rocket fist. Otherwise it won't be able to reach the target, as remember, rocket punch has a 900 range. Just keep this in mind during your rotation, as you want to output as much DPS as possible while providing boons. For more on this build and others just like it, catch me streaming on Twitch. Stop by anytime and hang out. If you found this helpful, please subscribe and share with some friends. It will really help grow the channel.